Every once in a while, I have to go through my scrap wood pile and see what kind of home decor projects we can come up with. So today, that's what I'm doing. And since we're approaching the holidays, I sprinkled in some Christmas ideas as well. This project is pretty easy, and you don't need to use power tools if you don't have them. I grabbed a few 2x8 scraps from my shelf and one 2x6. I'm gonna make some wood houses, so you can use any size wood pieces that you have. I love having a variety of sizes. So to create the roof peaks of the houses, I first found the center of my board. Then I decided how tall I want the house before it started to angle in. And I made each house a little bit different. Once I had the roofs mapped out, I got out the chop saw. Now, since I made up my angles and just kind of freehanded them, I wasn't sure exactly what my angles were. And this saw has a laser on it, so I put the wood piece down and played around with the miter until the angle of the laser matched my pencil mark. And for this particular house, you can see I have the saw as far as it will go, which is 52 degrees. However, my saw does not go to 52 degrees on both sides, so I flipped the wood over and had to cut the second side without my pencil mark reference. So I used the triangle piece that I had just cut off to make sure that I cut it in the right spot on both sides were even. And you could always just use a handsaw or a miter box to do this. Then I repeated this with my other two houses. I didn't love that the two taller ones were pretty much the same height, so I cut one of them down to have 3 different heights. For the little chimneys of the houses, I'm also using scraps. I still have some of this copper pipe after using it on a few other projects, so I marked where I want the chimney to go, and then I used a 7/8 inch spade bit to make a hole. The copper pipe is 3/4 of an inch, so you need to make the hole slightly bigger so it will fit. When drilling the holes, you want to start out holding the drill level with the angle of the roof, and then slowly raise your arm while drilling to make the hole go straight up and down. This is the easiest way that I have found to make a hole like this. If you try to drill straight down on the angled roof, your spade bit is just going to jump around all over the place and not give you a clean hole. I'm not going to add the pipe chimneys onto the houses just yet. I want to get them painted first so I don't get paint on the copper. So I painted the houses white, and at first I gave them a light wash of paint to see that wood grain through, but decided I didn't like that look and added a thicker coat of paint. On the second coat of paint, while it was still wet, I added in some light gray and blended the paints together. This is a very subtle detail, but I didn't want the houses a solid stark white. I didn't add the gray all over, just randomly to add some dimension. And here you can see the difference. The one on the left just looks a little bit more vibrant and wintry with that gray blend. Alright, now for the details. I wanted to make each house different, yet still sit together as a little trio. So the largest house is going to be the background, and I'm adding some snowflakes to this one. I'm using an IOD mold to do this, but you can use other things to get a similar look. You could use a stencil and joint compound to make the snowflakes look three-dimensional, or you could add snowflake stickers, or even just use a stamp. I know these molds are not for everyone, so I like to give alternative options. I used air dry clay with the molds, and while the clay is still wet, I'm going to glue them onto my wood house. This way they will form to the contours of the wood, and I can also wrap a few of the snowflake arms around the sides of the house, or easily cut off any sections I don't want, like along the bottom. And then I set this one aside to dry. Alright, for the middle house, I'm going to use this stunning decoupage paper that my girl Brandy over at the DIY Struggle has sent to me. She has been working her little booty off, coming up with these elegant and amazing designs, and I don't know about you, but I haven't seen anything like these out in the market. I'll link her website in my description box in case you want to check them out for yourself. She has more than just holiday designs and is working on new releases, so keep your eyes out. I chose this vintage looking letter with train and tree details, and I cut it out with my scissors first, but I like the edges of my decoupage paper to be ripped so that it blends into my project a little more seamlessly. This particular design also doesn't cover the entire surface of my wood house, and I'm going to need to blend it in. So I got a paintbrush with water to start tearing at the edges. I wish I hadn't taken off half of that stamp, but that's okay, not a big deal. Next, I'm using my liquid patina to apply the paper onto the wood surface. And you can use Mod Podge or decoupage glue. I know that the Dollar Tree sells both of those. Once the decoupage was dry, I'm taking several different paint colors to start blending the paper into the background. The paper has a lot of dimension in the colors, so this took me some trial and error and lots of blending to make it look cohesive. When doing a technique like this, you want to stipple your paintbrush rather than use brush strokes. This is going to give you a better blend. There may be areas where brushstrokes work a little bit better, but for this particular project, it was all about layering the colors and having those areas of light and dark. I did go in with my fingers from time to time as well to soften some of the edges. Guys, if you are enjoying this video, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my content. I can see that 90% of people watching my videos are not subscribed, so go ahead, hit that button. What are you waiting for? Now for the smallest house, I'm using another decoupage paper, but this time just cutting out 2 of the reindeer. I cut them out pretty close to the body of the deer, but then left the intricate section of the antlers as they are. I didn't want to make the paper too fragile and end up ripping it. Then I decoupaged the deer onto the front of the little house. This paper just melted right into the wood surface and looks like it was always on there. Since the liquid patina does have a slight sheen to it, I didn't want the deer sections to stand out off of that flat white background, so I added a layer of top coat to the entire surface. And that's it for this little trio. I think it came together beautifully and tells a nice little story with the snowflakes falling in the background and the reindeer jumping in the foreground. I just love how this turned out. This project is something you can leave out all year long. I bought this set of 6 chairs at the Goodwill bins a while back because I loved the variety of spindles on it. I want to use the 4 legs of this chair to create a lantern and use the spindles as the pillars. I've never seen anyone do this, but please let me know if you have because I thought it was such a great idea. And it's pretty easy to wiggle these chairs apart without damaging the spindles. The one downside is that you now have holes in the spindles where they were attached to the chair. So to fix that, I'm using a dowel to fill it in. Simply added wood glue to the hole, added in the dowel, and then used a thin flush cut saw to cut off the excess. The dowel size I had was a tiny bit too small for the hole, so then I used some wood filler to fill in the gaps. I think this particular wood filler was old or something because I didn't love how it was looking. I had added on 2 layers of this, letting it dry in between, and it would keep shrinking and not filling in this space entirely. So then I got out my joint compound and used that to fill in the rest of the gaps. This worked out much better. Next, I gave the spindles a scuff sand before painting them, just so the paint doesn't scratch right off of that slick surface. I also added a layer of Dixie Belle Slick Stick just for some added security. This is essentially a primer and very similar to the Zinsser 123 primer. Then I painted them in a grayish brown color called Prairie Gray. Now for the top and the bottom, I'm using a scrap 1x12 board and cut it down into 2 10-inch by 10-inch square pieces. Since the spindles have so much detail, I want the top and the bottom to match that elegance and not just look like a basic piece of cut wood. Again, I've had these trim pieces left over from other projects in my stash. I'm going to use this beveled looking one around the bottom section. This is also going to conceal the bottoms of the spindles since they don't exactly cover the corners of the wood base. The trim is super easy to cut. You could use miter shears, but since I was already out in the garage, I decided to use the saw. Once I had the pieces cut down, I glued them down directly on top of the wood base. And for the top of the lantern, I wanted there to be a little bit more to it, so I cut down another 1x12 and made it an 8-inch square. This time I'm going to cut the same trim down and glue it directly around the side edges of the smaller wood square. And on the larger wood square, I'm using the spiral looking trim and that same beveled one stacked together. Except this time I'm flipping the beveled one upside down so the thin section is facing down. And this will mirror how I have it on the bottom. This step isn't necessary, but because I'm a perfectionist, I'm going to fill in all of the seams with wood filler. This just helps to make your project look more high-end and store-bought. I'm going to stain the wood, so I made sure to wipe off any excess wood filler as soon as I applied it, since it does not take the stain the same way that the wood itself does. And then I stained all of the wood with Early American. Before I can put all the pieces together, I need to trim down the spindles so that they're all the same height. Then I used wood glue to add the spindles to the base. I started with the bottom and added them right into the corners of the wood base. I let that dry before adding the top because the spindles taper in and I want to make sure it's centered. Then I flipped the lantern upside down and glued the top of the spindles. You want to pay attention here to make sure the wood grain is facing the same direction on both the top and the bottom. All that's left to do is to decorate this guy up. Like I said at the beginning, you could use this all year round. I'm just decorating for Christmas since we're heading into that time of year. For this project, I'm using these scrap 1x2 pieces that I have from attempting to make a privacy screen over the summer. I had stained the wood and then decided to cut a foot of it off, so I have these 1-foot sections left over. Now, this project is not difficult, but it does require a miter saw or a way to cut a 30-degree angle. I'm making a wood tree, and all of these pieces will have the same angle on both sides. Next, I figured out how long I need my first bottom piece of the tree to be, and I will pop all the measurements on the screen in a minute. My saw has a laser on it, which is super helpful in cutting a piece like this because my line is showing the full length of the piece, but since I need to cut it at an angle, I need to start a little bit further back from that line. If you don't have a laser, you can cut the wood longer and then slowly cut away at it until you have the length that you need. I wanted to paint the trees using my milk paint. I have 2 different brands here, and this was the first time that I had tried the Fusion brand. In the past, I haven't cared for milk paint, but wanted to give a different brand a shot to compare. Milk paint is typically used to get a weathered and chippy paint look, and I've always tried to force it to work. This time I decided to just let the paint do its thing, and however it turns out, great. I'm using an off-white color for one tree and then a green for the second. I ended up having to put 3 coats of the white on. I wasn't expecting the paint to chip much because the paint that was already on the wood is a deck over paint, which is thick and coarse. Milk paint needs more of a slick surface with less adhesion for it to crack, but the white Fusion brand milk paint actually did chip a little bit. When I sanded it down, the chipping was pretty much just on the corners and the edges, so the scrap wood pieces ended up looking slightly worn and distressed. I like how they turned out. The green ones didn't chip, but I still sanded them smooth, and you can see a little bit of the brown paint underneath show through. Alright, now we can put the tree together. I'm using wood glue for the best hold and gluing the longer 6-inch piece to one of the 5-inch pieces. The 30-degree angle should line right up and rest against the longer piece, which creates the top of the tree. I set that aside to set up for a minute, moved on to glue the bottom of the tree. Here you take the 10-inch piece and 2 of the 5-inch pieces that will go on either side. The angles should line up so that the 5-inch pieces are sitting flush with the bottom of that 10-inch piece. And again, I set this section aside to start drying. Once I was able to pick up the top and the bottom and the glue wasn't sliding around, I can add on the last 2 5-inch pieces. I want to make sure they are evenly placed on either side and measure the distance between the 2 ends. Then I added glue to the flat surface, and before I squeezed the pieces together, I measured one last time. This way I can easily move it into place if I'm a little bit off. And the last piece to glue down is the 4-inch piece that will be the trunk. I was pretty spot on in eyeballing it to the center, but still measured it just in case. Then just to touch up some of the areas where you could see the glue, I took my leftover milk paint and brushed it on top. That's it for this one. You could decorate them further and add some pine picks or ornaments, but I wanted to keep mine minimal. This project is not Christmas related, and I'm using this giant 2-foot by 8-foot white birch plywood that I had bought to use in Mason's bedroom makeover. But he had changed his mind, of course, and didn't want it as his desktop anymore, so today I'm using it to create a set of asymmetrical display shelves. I first cut the board down to a more manageable size piece with my circular saw. Then I ripped the board so I had two 10-inch wide pieces. You will have about a 4-inch piece left over. So now I need to cut an angle on the top and the bottom of the boards. And at first I cut a 45-degree angle, then realized that was way too much and I didn't like how steep it was. I didn't want to cut down another part of the large board to start over, so I ended up making the shelves slightly shorter than I thought they would be. And I used my circular saw again to cut along my line. I cut the same angle on both sides of the board and hold on to those triangle pieces that get cut off. We're going to use them. After cutting the pieces down, I sanded the edges. My saw blade is a little bit old and needs replaced on the circular saw, so it was chewing up these edges. Next, I stained the back sides of my boards to match the front that I had already done for Mason's bedroom. I used Early American as the first layer and then transparent espresso on top. This is going to be the background part of the shelf that sits flat against the wall. Now I need to make the shelf. So I cut down another piece of the wood to be the same width as the background, and I made it 5 inches deep. Remember I said to hold on to those angle pieces that we cut off earlier? I'm going to use those now as the side of the shelf. I need them to be 5 inches deep as well, so I measured where 5 inches is and then drew a line from the top of the triangle down to that 5-inch mark. I'm only cutting down 2 triangles, one for each shelf. And these are going to go on opposing sides. You'll see how that looks here shortly, but first I need to glue all the parts together. I want there to be some contrast with the shelves, so I'm painting this part black. And I'm using the same color I used on my faux fireplace mantle build, Dark Secret by Bear, in a satin finish. I painted everything except for the back that still needs to be glued and attached to the background board. Wood glue works best when you can attach the raw wood together. The background is already stained, but it'll still glue to that raw wood. However, trying to use wood glue on a satin finish latex paint may not have the best adhesion. Once the paint was dry, I glued the shelf onto the background, and for additional stability, since this is a display shelf, I added in 2 screws as well. This project is something I wanted to make out of necessity. My husband and I bought a new bed recently and he built a wood frame for it. Now I'm only 5'1" and the frame he built is very tall off of the ground. I love having a taller bed, but needed something to help this short girl get in and out easily. I was using a cheap little plastic stool that I've always had around the house, but wanted to build a step stool for myself to match the bed a little bit better. I'm taking a scrap 2x12 board and cut it down to 14 inches. This is going to be the sides of the step stool, so you need 2 of them. And the easiest way to cut 2 boards the exact same size is to stack the first cut on top of the next board. Make sure that the end is flush and then slide the wood until the top cut piece hits your saw blade, and then remove that top board and cut the second piece. Next, I took a 2x10 and cut 2 24-inch pieces. These are going to be the steps. Now I need to cut a notch out of the 2x12 boards that are 14 inches long. Like I said, this is going to be the side of the stool and it's going to have 2 steps. So I placed one of the step boards on top to see where I need to cut. The first step is going to be 4 inches off of the ground, so I measured 4 inches up from the bottom of the board, and then I drew a line up to that first mark I made of how far in the step will sit. Then I cut the notch out with my circular saw and repeated that on the second side. This stool is coming together so well, but once I put the step on to make sure that it all fits, I noticed there was a little overhang on the front. So I marked where the board sits so I can cut that off. Next, I'm adding in some pocket holes. I don't want to see screws on the outside, so this way they will be hidden. Now comes the fun part. I'm gonna give this wood some color by burning it. I'm using a butane torch to do this, and burning the wood is another way to make that grain stand out. Since my husband burned the wood of our bed frame, I wanted to do the same here so that they match. I did make the stools a little bit different though, and burned it more than the bed frame for a little bit less contrast. But this is personal preference. You can burn the wood as much or as little as you like, or not at all. Stain works too. After all the wood was burned, I'm taking a wire brush to knock off any of that loose ash. I really loved the color of the wood after I did the wire brush, but I needed to seal the wood too. I'm a little bit disappointed that once I added the polyacrylic, it made the tone much darker. I think that may have been because I had used a satin sealer. It was the only finish that I had on hand, so I wonder if using matte would have darkened it a little bit less. But now it's time to put it all together. This was a little bit tricky because of the notches in the sideboards. I had to hold the sides on top of the step and screw them down together this way. that's it for this stool, and I am so happy with how it turned out. The length and the height are perfect for helping me to get in and out of bed.